Okay, so have you ever felt like stuck, like you're hitting your head against the same wall trying to make progress?
Yeah.
Well, you're not alone. One listener actually wrote in wanting us to unpack this whole being stuck thing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they even sent over this source, What Holding a Human Being Back? Break it down for me, .pdf.
Okay.
So I thought we could take this as our cue to deep dive into what holds us back and hopefully how to break free.
I think that's a great idea, and I think this source is a great place to start because it really digs into the deeper reasons we get stuck, not just the surface stuff.
Yeah, and I like how it breaks those reasons down into two main categories, starting with what it calls internal barriers.
Right? These are those things we carry around inside us that trip us up.
Exactly, and the source lists things like fear and self-doubt and limiting beliefs.
It's like this tangled web of internal obstacles, and they all influence each other,
Mm.
Like fear, for example. I
Mm.
feel like that's often the root cause when you really start to dig a little deeper.
Ugh, tell me about it. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of what other people will think.
Right? It's exhausting. And because these fears often operate on this subconscious level, we don't even realize they're in the driver's seat impacting all of our decisions.
And they can show up in so many sneaky ways, like that classic I'm not good enough thing.
Oh, yeah, the source mentions that one. I'm not good enough.
Yeah.
It seems so simple. But when you think about how many people carry that belief, it's insidious.
It really is. It's
You know?
like it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy. If you truly believe you're not good enough, you're not going to go after the things you want in life.
Exactly. Like that promotion you've been wanting, or even just mustering up the courage to start that creative project you've always dreamed of doing.
Ugh. And that's not even touching on negative self-talk,
Oh, right.
which is another big one the source talks about.
Yeah, that constant inner critic. And then there's this other layer that we can't forget about, and that's emotional wounds.
Oh, man. Yeah, those past experiences that leave a mark on us.
Exactly like when we've been hurt or rejected or experienced some kind of failure, it can have a lasting impact.
It's like our brains create these defense mechanisms to protect ourselves from getting hurt again.
Right, and so we avoid situations or people that might trigger those old wounds.
Which I guess is a form of self-preservation, but it can also keep us from really living our lives to the fullest. So
Okay.
how do we stop those past experiences from holding us back? Well, the source talks about the importance of actually addressing those emotional wounds. Sometimes that looks like therapy,
Yeah.
which can be so helpful for creating a safe space to process those past experiences. But it can also be about just cultivating more self-awareness,
Yep.
like noticing when those old patterns are popping up and being willing to challenge the stories we're telling ourselves about those events.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, but I think it's also important to point out here that it's not always about what's going on in our heads.
No, totally.
Like sometimes the obstacles in our way are external, stuff that's totally out of our control. And thankfully, the source gets into this as well in this section on external circumstances. Yes. And this, I think, is where so many people get tripped up because it's so easy to fall into the trap of self-blame. Like, oh, I'm just not trying hard enough. When in reality, there are very real external barriers that are playing a role.
Totally. And the source breaks down these external factors into a few key buckets. We've got a lack of resources, we've got unsupportive environments, and we've got societal pressures. Like, just to start with resources, sometimes the biggest hurdle is not having access to what you need to succeed.
Total.
Whether that's financial resources, support systems, whatever.
Yeah, and I think it's important to acknowledge how all of these external factors can kind of overlap and create this like compounding effect.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like for example, the source specifically calls out a lack of access to quality education,
Right.
which can be influenced by so many things outside of a person's control, like their socioeconomic background or where they happen to live.
It's like being dealt a different hand in life for the very beginning, and then you layer on top of that societal pressures and expectations, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, this is a lot.
It is a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And then to make matters worse, we live in a culture that often downplays the role of these external factors, right?
Mhm.
And emphasizes this idea of individual responsibility above all else,
Mm-hmm.
which can lead to a lot of shame and inadequacy when people struggle to achieve certain things, even if those things were way harder to achieve because of factors beyond their control.
Yes. It's like we're conditioned to blame ourselves first without even stopping to consider the bigger picture.
Exactly. And so this deep dive is all about recognizing all of the factors at play, both internal and external, because understanding where these obstacles come from and how they operate
Mm-hmm.
and how they're often interconnected is a huge step in overcoming them.
So we've covered those inner hurdles like fear and those pesky limiting beliefs, and we even touched on external things that can make life feel like an uphill battle.
Right.
But the source doesn't stop there. It goes on to talk about something called psychological patterns, and this is where I feel like things get really interesting.
Totally. Because this section highlights how we develop these habits and these thought patterns that keep us stuck.
It's not just the fear itself, it's that we procrastinate because of the fear.
Exactly. And the source actually uses this term, resistance to change, which I think is a perfect way to describe this because our brains are kind of wired to choose comfort and familiarity, even when it's not really serving us.
Yeah, it's true. Like our comfort zone is called that for a reason.
I feel safe.
Yeah.
But staying stuck in our comfort zone, especially in a world that's constantly changing, means we might be missing out on some really cool opportunities for growth.
Absolutely. But knowing this and actually changing those deeply ingrained patterns are two very different things. What can we do to actually rewire those patterns?
Well, I like that the source emphasizes the importance of mindfulness, which is really just about paying more attention to what's happening in our minds and our bodies, like noticing when those resistant thoughts pop up and asking ourselves, is this fear talking or is this actual, fact?
So it's about separating the actual risk from the risk we've created in our minds.
Yeah. And a lot of times that perceived risk is way bigger than the actual risk.
Totally.
And then the other thing I think is interesting that the source talks about in this section is unprocessed emotions,
Okay.
past traumas, things like that. Because sometimes we have these unresolved emotional experiences that create these energetic blocks for us and keep us feeling stuck, even if we don't realize it.
So it's like we're carrying around all this baggage from the past that's weighing us down and making it harder to move forward.
Exactly.
And speaking of baggage, I feel like this leads us to another really important piece that the source touches on, and that's the role of environmental influences.
Right. And this is where we start to zoom out a little bit because it's not just about what's happening internally for us. It's also about acknowledging the influence of the larger systems that we live in.
Absolutely. And this is something that can be really easy to overlook, but when you stop and think about it, the impact is huge.
It's huge.
Like, think about social media, for example, and how those algorithms can create these echo chambers of information that end up shaping our perceptions of the world.
Absolutely. And not always in a good way.
It's like we're bombarded with these curated versions of reality that make us feel like we're not enough.
Right, right. And then on top of that, we have to think about political systems and social systems that can either empower us or keep us stuck.
And like you said earlier, acknowledging these influences, that's a good first step, but knowledge without action isn't going to create any change.
Exactly. So let's talk about what we can actually do about all of this.
Yes, because thankfully, the source doesn't just leave us hanging. It actually offers some really practical steps that we can take to start to break free. Okay, so we've journeyed through those internal barriers, we navigated the external obstacles, and we even uncovered some of those sneaky psychological patterns that can keep us tethered to the same old stories.
We really did. It's been quite the deep dive.
It really has. But I love how this source doesn't just point out all the obstacles in our way.
Right.
It actually gives us some tools to start to break free from those obstacles.
Yes. And those tools are in the next section called How to Overcome.
Okay, so let's hear it. What's the secret?
Well, there's no magic bullet, but I do think there's a lot of wisdom in these 7 suggestions.
7. Okay, well, let's take them one at a time. What's the first one?
The first one is face your fears, which I know sounds kind of cliche, like, yeah, I never heard that before. But
Right.
the way the source explains it is really interesting because it emphasizes that we don't have to conquer all our fears at once.
Right, like start small.
Exactly. It's about
Yeah.
those small, manageable steps.
So maybe instead of letting fear completely paralyze us, what if we challenged ourselves to just confront one small fear this week?
Yes, I love that. And once we start chipping away at those fears, we can move on to number 2, which is challenge your limiting beliefs.
Okay.
And this one really resonated with me because it's so easy to let those negative thoughts just run on autopilot.
Totally, like a broken record player just stuck on repeat with all the I can'ts and the I'm not enoughs.
Exactly. And we start to believe those thoughts. But what if we actually wrote them down, got them out of our heads and onto paper? Because sometimes when we can see them for what they are, which is just thoughts, it takes away some of their power.
Oh, for sure.
And while we're in the process of rewriting those internal scripts, we can also work on number 3, which is cultivate self-compassion.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Because it's really easy to beat ourselves up when we make mistakes or when we don't live up to our own expectations. But
Yeah.
what if we treated ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer a close friend who's going through a hard time?
So important. It's like we all need to be our own best cheerleaders.
Yes. And speaking of cheerleaders, that kind of leads into number 4, which is build a strong support system because we can't do this alone.
We weren't meant to.
We need those people in our corner,
Mm.
the ones who believe in us even when we doubt ourselves. And sometimes that support might also mean seeking professional help.
Yeah. Therapy can be really helpful for those deeper issues that we haven't been able to resolve on our own.
Right. It can be a game changer. Okay, number 5 on the list is developing a growth mindset,
Ooh, I love that one.
which is really about reframing challenges as opportunities. It's seeing setbacks as stepping stones rather than roadblocks.
It's like that saying, what is it? Everything you want is on the other side of fear. Like
Yes.
you have to push through those uncomfortable moments to get to the good stuff.
You do, and that's how we grow. And, number 6 kind of ties into that because it's all about taking action. Take action.
Because all the knowledge and inspiration in the world won't make a difference unless we actually put it into practice.
Exactly. It's about bridging that gap between knowing and doing. So what's one small step that you can take today to move towards the life that you want?
I love that question. And listeners, we would love to hear what resonates with you from this episode. What are you going to work on? What are you going to tackle first?
What are you waiting for? Let us know.
Yes. And until next time, keep exploring, keep growing, and keep diving deep.